She was 61 years old and down to the last $11 of a life that had once held more than she could count. The bank that took it from her was the First Trust of Iberia Parish, and the man who signed the papers was Nathaniel Pruitt, who had smiled at her the whole time he did it, calling it regrettable business, as though the word could soften the sound of a door closing. What she had left after the auctioneer's gavel fell on her husband's tools, her mother's china, and the modest house on Bayou Teche where she had raised 2 children now grown and scattered, fit inside a carpetbag that had seen better decades. And so, with those $11 folded tight in her glove, Odile Fontenot walked into the parish courthouse in the spring of 1887 and paid every cent of it for a flooded, half-collapsed sugar mill on the edge of St. Martinville that the bank had seized from a dead man and could not sell to anyone with sense. The mill sat black and silent in cypress water, its roof caved, its great iron vats rusted through, and the men at the courthouse laughed behind their hands as she signed her name. It was, by any reasonable measure, the purchase of a desperate woman throwing her last coin into a swamp. But beneath those ruined vats, sealed away where no flood had ever reached, waited something that would not merely change the fortune of one widow, it would return to an entire community what a rich man's cruelty had stolen from it long before Odile Fontenot ever set foot on that ruined ground. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Odile Fontenot. If you have ever stood in a forgotten place and felt, against all reason, that it still had something to give, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Odile Boudreau had been born in 1826 on a small farm outside St. Martinville, the third of 7 children in a Creole family that measured its wealth not in land but in what it could make with its hands. Her father, Etienne, was a cooper by trade, building the barrels that carried sugar molasses down the bayou to New Orleans, and her mother, Cecile, kept a kitchen garden so exacting that neighbors joked she could grow okra from a stone. It was from her mother that Odile learned the patience of things that take time, the slow unfurling of a bean vine, the way a root needed to be watched and stirred and never rushed, the understanding that value was not always visible on the first day or the first year. It was from her father that she learned how to read its grain, how to know where it was sound and where it was rotten, how a barrel that looked plain on the outside could be the difference between molasses that traveled safely to market and molasses that spoiled and ruined a season's labor. Etienne would let her sit in his workshop on Saturday afternoons, sanding staves smooth while he explained that a cooper's whole trade was trust that a man buying a barrel could not see inside it, could not know if the joints would hold. And so a cooper's name had to mean something, had to be worth more than the wood itself. She carried that lesson with her for the rest of her life, though she would not understand its full weight until she was an old woman standing in ankle-deep water inside a ruined mill. At 19, she married Baptiste Fontenot, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who worked the cane fields and dreamed, in the patient way of men who have never had much, of one day owning a small plot of his own. They settled in a cabin near the bayou, and though the years brought hardship, a bad freeze in 1849 that killed half the cane in the parish, a fever that took their firstborn son before his second birthday, they also brought a steady kind of happiness that Odile would later describe to her grandchildren as the only wealth that never depreciated. She bore 2 more children who lived, a daughter, Marguerite, and a son, Joseph, and she raised in the way her mother had raised her, teaching Marguerite to read the seasons in the garden and teaching Joseph, when he was old enough, some of what her father had taught her about wooden honesty and the invisible architecture trust. Baptiste worked himself into a foreman's position at the mill owned by old Dr. Aurelien Savary, a man widely respected in the parish for his fairness, and for a time it seemed the Fontenots might climb, slowly and honestly, into a kind of modest security that had eluded both their families for generations. The mill itself, the very one Odile would one day buy for $11, had been Savary's pride, a handsome brick and timber operation on the bayou's edge that processed cane for a dozen small farms too poor to afford their own crushing equipment. Savary was not like the larger planters of the parish. He took a fair share, kept honest books, and was known to extend credit to struggling families without charging usurious interest, a rarity in that era and place. Odile remembered him from her girlhood as a soft-spoken man with ink-stained fingers who sometimes stopped to admire her father's barrels and speak of them with real appreciation, understanding, as few men of his class did, that the humble craft of the cooper was what made the whole sugar economy possible. It was Savary, in fact, who had first employed Baptiste as a young man, and who had spoken kindly to Odile at her wedding, telling her that a marriage, like a good barrel, was built stave by stave, and needed to be tended before it could hold anything of worth. She did not know, in those years, that Savory carried secrets of his own, that the mill she would one day inherit through poverty and desperation held something he had hidden inside it during the darkest chapter of his life, a chapter that would not surface until decades after his death. The fall came slowly, the way most ruinous things do, disguised for years as simple bad luck. Baptiste died in 1871, crushed beneath a wagon wheel on a rain-slick road, leaving Odile a widow at 45 with 2 children nearly grown and a small savings that seemed, at the time, sufficient. She took in sewing and, later, laundry, and made do, as women of a generation were expected to make do, without complaint and without much help. Marguerite married a riverboat clerk and moved to Baton Rouge. Joseph took work on the docks in New Orleans, sending what money he could, though a young man's wages stretched thin against a young man's needs. Odile might have managed well enough on her own modest means had it not been for Nathaniel Pruitt, a banker who arrived in St. Martinville in the early 1880s with northern capital and a southern smile, and who began quietly buying up the debts of struggling widows and farmers across the parish, consolidating them into a portfolio of vulnerable people he could squeeze at his leisure. Odile had borrowed a small sum against her house in 1883 to cover a bad harvest year, a debt she fully intended to repay, and had repaid faithfully for 3 years, until Pruitt's bank threw a clause she had not understood, and a clerk who had not explained it called the note due in full during the depressed cane markets of 1886, a year when no one in the parish had money to spare. She begged for time. She offered to work off the debt in any capacity the bank required. Pruitt, who had by then also quietly acquired a deed to the abandoned Savory Mill, listed among the bank's worthless holdings after old Dr. Savory's estate collapsed into disrepair following his death, told her with practiced sympathy that business was business, and that regrettable as it was, the house would be sold to satisfy the note. Within a season, Odile Fontenot, who had spent 40 years building a small, honest life stave by Cafel Stave, watched it come apart entirely, the auctioneer's voice flat and indifferent as it dispersed the pieces of a marriage to strangers for pennies on the dollar. She might have gone to live with Marguerite in Baton Rouge, and indeed her daughter begged her to come, but something in Odile, some stubborn inheritance from her Cooper father, resisted the idea of arriving at her child's door with nothing but a borrowed bed and a broken spirit. It was in this state of proud, desperate stubbornness that she found herself at the parish courthouse on a humid April morning, watching a clerk read off a list of properties the bank wished to liquidate, most of them worthless scraps of land no one wanted. When he came to the former Savory Sugar Mill, St. Martinville, flooded and condemned, sold as is, the room actually laughed, because everyone in the parish knew the mill had sat abandoned and half-drowned since Savory's death 11 years before, and no sane person would touch it. But Odile remembered the mill from her girlhood, remembered Savory's kind ink-stained hands admiring her father's barrels, remembered that whatever ruin had overtaken the building, it had once been built by honest men with honest purpose. And she thought, with a particular clarity that comes to people who have truly nothing left to lose, that $11 for a roof, however broken, was better than no roof at all. She raised a hand before she had fully decided to, and the clerk, startled, sold her the mill for every cent she owned, while Nathaniel Pruitt, seated at the front of the room reviewing other papers, did not even glance up. The walk out to the mill took her the better part of an afternoon, and when she arrived, wading through the shallow floodwater that had claimed the ground floor, she understood fully for the first time the scale of her own foolishness. The roof had fallen in over the east wing, admitting rain and sun both, and green moss had crept up the brick in long fingers that made the building look less like a ruin, and more like something being slowly reclaimed by the bayou itself. The great iron vats where cane juice had once been boiled down to sugar stood rusted and half-submerged, and the machinery that had once driven the rollers lay tangled and orange with corrosion. But the west wing, she found, climbing over fallen timber with the hem of her dress soaked through, had fared better, its roof mostly intact, its walls sound enough that she thought, with the practical mind her mother had given her, that a person could at least sleep dry there if the weather held. She spent that first night on a bed of cleared timber and old cane sacking, listening to the frogs and the drip of water from the broken east roof, and told herself firmly that she would think about tomorrow when tomorrow came. It was on her third day at the mill, while clearing debris from around the base of the largest vat in hopes of salvaging the iron for scrap money, that Odile noticed something her Cooper's eye would not let her ignore. The stone platform beneath the vat, on which the great iron drum rested, did not sit quite level with the floor around it, and where the mortar met the flagstones there was a hairline seam that ran too straight, too deliberate, to be the work of settling or decay. She had spent enough hours in her father's workshop, learning to read wood and stone and joinery, to know the difference between a structure that had simply aged and one that had been built with intention to conceal. Her hands, though 61 years old and stiffened by decades of labor, remembered the patience her mother had taught her in the garden, and she spent the better part of 2 days working a thin iron bar into that seam, prying with the same slow, careful pressure her father had used to see the stubborn barrel stave, until at last a section of the platform lifted away to reveal a narrow stone stairway descending into darkness beneath the vat room floor. She did not go down that first evening, some old caution in her holding her back until morning light, but she lay awake turning over in her mind everything she knew of old Dr. Savary in the years before his mill fell to ruin, and by dawn she could wait no longer. The stairway led to a narrow chamber, dry despite the flooding above, its walls lined with brick and its air thick with the particular stillness of a room untouched for years. Inside, she found 4 wooden chests, their iron fittings tarnished but their timber sound, protected from decades of Louisiana damp by the chamber's careful construction. And beside the chests, wrapped in oilcloth and remarkably preserved, she found a leather ledger and a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, both bearing, in careful copperplate script, the name of Aurelian Savary. The ledger told a story Odile had never known, one that reshaped everything she believed about the fair, soft-spoken doctor of her girlhood. In the years before the war, Savary had quietly used the mill and its books to shelter something far more valuable than sugar profits, a network of manumission funds and hidden accounts belonging to free people of color and formerly enslaved families throughout the parish, money and land deeds that, had they been discovered by certain of his neighbors or by Confederate authorities during the war years, would have been seized, destroyed, or turned against the very families they were meant to protect. Savary, it seemed, had served for years as a discreet trustee for dozens of parish families, holding their savings, their land claims, and their manumission papers in trust when banks would not serve them and courts would not protect them, charging no fee, asking no recognition, because recognition itself would have endangered the very people he sought to help. The chests held gold and silver coin, patiently accumulated interest owed to families who had entrusted their savings to him, along with the original deeds to several small parcels of land that had been quietly held in the mill's name to shield them from seizure during and after the war. The letters, written in Savary's own hand but never sent, explained that he had intended to reveal the trust and distribute its contents once reconstruction had stabilized enough to make the transfer safe, but that his health had failed suddenly in 1876. And he had died, it seemed, before he ever found the moment he judged safe enough, leaving his secret sealed beneath the vats along with the fortunes of families who had no idea their trust remained, hidden and waiting, all these years. Odile sat in that dry stone chamber for a long while, the ledger open on her lap, understanding with a slow, dawning horror that she now possessed something far heavier than mere treasure. These were not her riches to spend. There were promises made by a dead man to living families, promises that circumstance had left unfulfilled for over a decade. She thought of her father's barrels, of the trust that Cooper's name was supposed to guarantee, and she understood, sitting there in the cool dark, that she had been handed by accident, by poverty, by the strange justice of an $11 auction the chance to finish what Aurelian Savary had died before he could complete. But finishing it proved far harder than discovering it. Word traveled quickly in a small parish, and though Odile tried to move carefully, quietly beginning to cross-reference the ledger's names against families still living in St. Martinville, it was not long before Nathaniel Pruitt caught wind that the widow he had ruined was spending her days at the old mill with unusual purpose, hiring a wagon, meeting privately with certain families after dark. Pruitt, whose bank still held papers on half the land in the parish, and whose fortune depended on precisely the kind of quiet leverage that came from knowing what others did not, made inquiries of his own. And when he learned through a talkative clerk who had once handled Savary's estate that the mill's foundations had never been properly searched before the bank seized and then dumped the worthless property, he arrived at Odile's door with a proposition dressed as generosity. He offered to buy the mill back from her for $200, a sum that would have seemed a fortune to the woman he had left with 11, and he framed it, as men like Pruitt always framed such things, as a kindness to a struggling widow who surely had no use for a flooded ruin. Odile understood at once what the offer meant. He suspected something, though he did not yet know what, and $200 was a small price to pay for a claim that might be worth vastly more. She refused him, politely but firmly, and Pruitt's manner cooled considerably. Within days, He had filed a claim in the parish court asserting that the original sale of the mill had been conducted in error, that the property's mineral and subterranean rights had never properly transferred, a legal maneuver so transparently opportunistic that even the sympathetic court clerk warned Odile privately that Pruitt intended to drag the matter through hearings until she either surrendered or ran out of money to contest it, a strategy that had worked against poorer families before. Hers. It was, Odile realized, the same pattern that had cost her the house on Bayou Teche, a wealthy man wielding paperwork like a weapon against people who could not afford the luxury of a lawyer. But this time, Odile was not alone in the fight, for as she had begun quietly locating the families named in Savary's ledger, the Duplessis family, whose grandmother's manumission papers lay among the documents, the elderly Toussaint sisters, who remembered as girls hearing whispers that Dr. Savary had kept something safe for their late mother. A dozen others scattered across the parish who had long since given up hope of any inheritance from a trust they barely remembered existed, she found. Herself no longer fighting merely for her own claim, but for theirs, and they, hearing her story, began to stand beside her. The hearing that followed, held in the same courthouse where Odile had once watched a home sold for a fraction of its worth, drew a crowd larger than the little parish building had seen in years, filled with the very families whose fortunes hung in the balance. Pruitt's lawyer argued technicalities of deed and mineral rights with practiced condescension, clearly expecting an old widow to fold under the weight of legal language designed to confuse rather than clarify. But Odile, standing before the judge with Savary's ledger open in her hands and the original letters as proof of intent, spoke not as a woman defending property but as a cooper's daughter defending a trust, explaining, in a plain, unhurried cadence her mother had taught her over a garden of slow-growing things, that a promise sealed beneath stone for 11 years was still a promise, and that the families in that room had waited long enough. She called forward the Toussaint sisters, who confirmed their mother's whispered memories. She produced Savary's own handwriting, unmistakable to the several parish residents old enough to recognize it, and she reminded the judge, gently but without flinching, that the bank itself had declared the mill and everything within it worthless when it sold the property for $11, forfeiting any claim to value discovered after fact. The judge, a cautious man not eager to be remembered as the one who let a northern banker strip a dying doctor's charitable trust from the very families it was meant to protect, ruled in Odile's favor, dismissing Pruitt's claim entirely and affirming that the content of the mill belonged, as the ledger specified, to her as owner, to distribute as she saw fit, a ruling that left Pruitt, for the first time since his arrival in the parish, visibly, publicly humbled, his reputation among the very farmers and widows he depended on for business quietly, permanently diminished from that day forward, as families who had once feared his bank began instead to speak of him, carefully but audibly, as a man who had tried to take what was never his. What Odile did next was, to some in the parish, more surprising than the discovery itself. She did not sell the coin for her own comfort, though God knew she had earned some measure of comfort after the years she had endured. Instead, working from Savary's careful ledger, she spent the following months tracking down every family listed in his accounts, and where families had passed on or scattered, their rightful shares in trust for whatever descendants could be found. The Duplessis family received a deed to land that had been quietly held for them since before the war, land they had believed lost forever. The Toussaint sisters received their mother's savings, grown modest interest over the decades, enough to repair their leaking roof and set aside something for the winter. Odile kept, from the whole discovery, only enough to repair the mill's east wing and pay the small debt she had accumulated since her ruin, and rather than sell the property or let it stand empty, she reopened it, with the community's help and blessing, as a modest cooperative mill once more, this time owned not by any single wealthy man but held collectively in trust for the small farming families of the parish, governed by a charter Odile herself drafted with the same careful, patient hand. Her father had used the cedar barrel stave, ensuring that no single person could ever again seize it out from under the people who depended on it. She named it, simply, the Savary Trust Mill, and hung inside its rebuilt front room a small frame page from the old ledger, so that anyone who came through the doors would understand exactly what kind of promise the building had once kept hidden, and now kept openly. She was 61 years old when the bank took everything she had, and she had $11 left to her name when she bought a flooded, condemned sugar mill that every reasonable person in the parish considered the last foolish act of a ruined woman. Odile Fontenot never forgot the sound of that courtroom laughter, nor the particular coldness in Nathaniel Pruitt's voice as he called her ruin regrettable business. But she came, in the years that followed, to understand that the very qualities that had made her seem foolish that spring morning, her stubborn refusal to see a thing as worthless simply because others had discarded it, her father's patient eye for what lay hidden beneath the plain surface, her mother's faith that some things simply needed time to reveal their value, were the same qualities that let her finish, at last, the quiet, unfinished promise of a good man who had died before he could complete it. What she found beneath those rusted vats was never truly her fortune to keep, and she knew it from the first moment she read Savary's careful handwriting in that dry stone chamber. It was a debt owed to an entire community, sealed away by circumstance and death, waiting patiently, as all true value sometimes must, for someone willing to look past a ruin and believe there was still something worth saving underneath. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Odile Fontenot's story tonight. If her patience and her refusal to let a broken thing stay broken move you even a little, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things and overlooked people often carry more worth than the world is willing to see at first glance. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone, and we love hearing where these stories find you. Until next time, stay close.